Okay, in this video we're going to see how we use our graphing calculator to come up with a least squares regression line for a set of data. So in your notes there you see under example 1, it says ecologists tracked 145 deer that were born in 1991, and the number of deer living on January 1st of each year is recorded in the table. And now question number 1 says, what is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable? Well, our independent variable is going to be time, or the year, and our dependent variable is going to be D, the number of deer living on January 1st of each one of the years. Okay, so number 2, it says enter the data into the lists of your calculator. Independent variable data in list 1 and dependent variable data in list 2. So if let's say I'm starting here from my main screen on my calculator, and I remember to get to the lists I first have to hit the stat button, which brings up this screen, and then I hit enter, which takes me to my lists. Now in my list 1 I want to enter my independent variable data, but I don't want to enter it as 1992, 1993. I want to enter 1992 as year 0, and then each of the following years, 1993 is going to be year 1, and then 94 is going to be year 2, and so on. And I believe I have got 8 years. I have 9 years, so that's up to 8, including year 0. And then in my list 2, I want to enter the number of deer alive on January 1st of each year, so that's going to be 145, 144. Okay, so there's all my data entered into my list. Now I want to sketch the scatter plot for my data, so I want to hit my blue second function button and then hit my y equals button, which takes me to the stat plot screen. And I already have, for my plot number 1, I can see it's already turned on. I've got scatter plot selected, my x values are in list 1, y values in list 2, and I'm using my little square as my mark, so that's all set to go. I've got my data in list 1 and list 2, so let me just hit my graph button, and I only have one data point that shows up, and I remember, oh yeah, I've got to set the scale. I've got to use my window button to set the scale. So let's see, what's going to be a good scale for me to use? Let's see, my independent variable, that's my year. Let's see, I've got 9 years, so let me use 0 to 10 for my independent variable. So my x min is 0, x max will be 10. All right, my y values, let's see, that's the number of deer alive. That goes from 145 down to 4. So let me go from 0, y min 0, and let me say y max is going to be 150. And that should get all my data points on there. So now if I hit graph, yeah, now there's my scatter plot. And now if I count all of my data points here, my squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I only see 8 data points on my screen. And the reason I only see 8 data points on my screen, if I go back to my window button, if I change that x min value to, let me change it to a -2, and I graph it again, now you can see kind of up there at the top left of the screen, it's trying to paint another box up there for the data point there at year 0. So just kind of moving that x min value over a little bit, it makes it a little easier to see that I actually do have a data point up there. Okay, now I want to calculate the equation of my least squares line. So let me go back to my main screen. I'll hit second quit, and I'm going to do this in very much the same way that I calculate a median line. I'm going to hit my stat button. I'm going to move over to the calc menu. And then remember, the median line is number 3. Now if you actually scroll down through all of these menu items, you see a whole bunch of different types of regression lines, but you don't see anything that says least squares regression. And the reason you don't see that is because the TI calculator, the TI84 calculator, it doesn't call the least squares regression line a least squares regression line. It just calls it linreg, for linear regression. And there's actually 2 different linear regression lines that you could, 2 different linear regression functions that you could choose. You could choose number 4, or you could choose number 8. Notice number 4 is going to give you your regression line in the form ax plus b, Number 8 is going to give it to you in the form a plus bx. It'll give you the same line, just slightly different format. So I'm going to choose number 4. And I'm also going to choose, I have to tell it where my x values and my y values are. My x values are in list 1, so second, and the number 1 key gives me list 1, comma, second, and the number 2 key gives me list 2. Now I'm also going to go ahead and tell it to put my least squares equation, when it calculates it, I'm going to tell it to go ahead and put that into y1. So let me do that now. I put a comma and I go to my vars, I hit my vars button, I go over to yvars, I select the function key, and I'm going to select y1 and hit enter, and that's going to tell it, that tells my linear regression function, my x values are in list 1, my y values are in list 2, and after you calculate the least squares regression line, I want you to go ahead and put that into the y1 line in the calculator. So let me go ahead and hit enter, and there's my linear regression, there's my least squares regression line. Y equals ax plus b. So my equation, and I can go ahead and fill that in on my notes here, my equation is going to be y equals negative 19.87x plus 157.13. So that's my equation, and now if you hit the y equal key on your calculator, you'll see that it has already put that equation into the y equals line, the y1 equals line on your calculator. So that just kind of saves you a step. It saves you from having to enter that in manually. Okay, and next I want to graph this line on my axes along with my scatter plot, so I just need to hit graph, hit my graph button, and there is my least squares regression line graphed along with my scatter plot. Now, one more thing we're going to talk about in this video is something called correlation. The least squares regression calculation, it also does an additional calculation in which it tells you the correlation between the two variables. Now the correlation between two variables just means the degree to which there is a linear relationship between your two variables, the degree to which there's a linear relationship between your x variable and your y variable. So the strength of this relationship is shown by the value of r, which is called the correlation coefficient. Now if you go back to the main screen here, where we just calculated the least squares line, there's also another calculation that it did, and depending on the settings that you have on your calculator, your R value may or may not already be on this screen. You can see on my screen it's not already on there. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to fix the settings on my calculator so that it will display the correlation coefficient value. And the way I do that is I want to hit my second button and then bring up the catalog, and that's the feature above the 0 button at the bottom of the calculator. So I say second, and then I hit my 0 button, and that brings up this catalog feature. And I want to scroll down to the D's in my catalog of functions here until I get to one that says diagnostic on, and there it is right there. I want to select this function here that says diagnostic on, so I put my arrow there and I hit enter, and there it brings it up on my main screen. Now I need to hit enter again to run this function, and it says done. Now if I just bring up that previous least squares regression calculation that I just did, now if I just bring this up and I hit enter again, it's going to give me the exact same equation, but notice it also gives me two additional lines down there at the bottom. One of them says r squared, and that one there at the bottom says r equals negative 0.9834. And that r value down at the bottom, that is the correlation coefficient for these two variables. The value of r is always a number between -1 and 1, and you'll see that our r value is negative 0.98. And if r is negative, that indicates that your two variables have a negative correlation. So we can see that our r value is negative, and all that tells you is that, if I go and look at the graph again, all that means is the fact that they have a negative correlation just means that as my x variable goes up, my y variable goes down. So that's all that negative correlation means. So if r is a positive number, then the two variables have a positive correlation. And finally, the other thing that we want to note about the correlation coefficient is that the closer the correlation coefficient is to 1 or to -1, the stronger is the linear relationship between the two variables. So I can see that the correlation coefficient for this for these two variables is negative 0.98. That number is very close to -1, which tells me that the relationship, the linear relationship between these two variables is in fact very strong. And in fact, I can confirm that just by looking at my data points. They lie very close to a straight line. So that just tells me that I have a very strong linear relationship between these two variables.